Welcome back to the channel. Today, we're diving into one of the most intense and thought-provoking topics: every prisoner executed in the United States in 2024. We'll walk you through their backgrounds, the crimes that led to their sentences, their final moments, last meals, and last words. Please remember, this isn't to sensationalize tragedy, but to educate and reflect on the realities of the death penalty in America. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and if you've got thoughts on this topic. Let's get started. Kenneth Eugene Smith. On January 25, 2024, Alabama made history and controversy when it executed Kenneth Eugene Smith, age 58, by nitrogen hypoxia, a method used for the first time in the U.S. But Smith's story begins decades earlier. At just 22, he became involved in a murder-for-hire plot that rocked the quiet community of Colbert County. Smith and an accomplice were hired to kill Elizabeth Sennett, a pastor's wife, in 1988. The crime was brutal, leaving the small town stunned. Smith was convicted and sentenced to death, but his journey through the court system spanned over 30 years, with appeals and retrials. In his final hours, Smith declined a special last meal, instead receiving the standard prison fare, a sandwich and chips. When asked for any last words, Smith offered a brief apology to the victim's family, expressing remorse but insisting he had changed as a person during his decades on death row. He said, "I'm not the man I was, and I pray you find peace." The use of nitrogen hypoxia drew international attention, sparking debate about execution methods. Smith's case remains a pivotal moment in death penalty history, marking both an ending and a new chapter in how America handles capital punishment. Ivan Abner Cantu, February 28, 2024. Texas. Ivan Abner Cantu, age 50, faced the execution chamber for a crime that haunted Dallas for years. In 2000, at 27, Cantu was convicted of murdering his cousin and the cousin's fiancée in a calculated robbery gone wrong. Prosecutors painted a picture of greed and cold calculation, but through his years on death row, Cantu maintained his innocence, claiming key evidence was ignored. In his last moments, Cantu requested a classic Texas last meal: cheeseburgers, fries, and a strawberry milkshake. As guards led him to the gurney, Cantu took the opportunity to speak to the families of the victims and his own supporters. "I'm sorry for the pain," he said. "I hope someday the truth comes out. I forgive, and I hope to be forgiven." His final words were broadcast to a silent witness room. The state moved forward despite ongoing protests outside the prison gates and last-minute appeals. The story of Ivan Cantu raises difficult questions about guilt, evidence, and what justice really means. His execution, while bringing closure for some, left others with lingering doubts and unresolved grief, a reminder that the lines in death penalty cases are rarely as clear as we hope. Willie James Pye. On March 20, 2024, Georgia executed Willie James Pye, age 59. Pye's crime took place back in 1993, when he was just 28 years old. The details of the murder were grim. A home invasion turned deadly, leaving a community shaken and a family forever changed. Over the years, Pye's appeals cited intellectual disability and ineffective counsel, but courts ultimately upheld his sentence. For his last meal, Pye requested fried chicken, mashed potatoes, and apple pie, a meal that echoed memories of home, perhaps an attempt at comfort before the end. When asked for his last words, Pye turned to the victim's family, his own, and those watching. He said, "I'm sorry for what happened. I wish I could go back and change it all. To my family, thank you for loving me despite everything." He closed his eyes, holding on to the memory of better times and the hope that his apology might offer some measure of peace. Pye's execution was met with both sorrow and protest, a divisive moment in Georgia's history. His story, like many, raises the tough question: is justice served by taking another life, or does it only deepen the pain for all involved? Michael DeWayne Smith, April 4th, 2024, Oklahoma. Michael DeWayne Smith was just 19 when he committed the crime that put him on death row. Now, at 41, he faced his final day. Smith's conviction stemmed from a double homicide during a robbery, one that left two families mourning and a neighborhood in fear. Through his time in prison, Smith's legal team argued his youth and troubled upbringing should have been considered, but appeals failed to stop the inevitable. For his last meal, Smith chose pizza, fried chicken, and soda. As the curtain was drawn back in the execution chamber, Smith looked straight ahead. When asked for his last words, he took a long pause before quietly saying, "I can't undo the past. I'm sorry. May God have mercy on me and on all of us." There were tears in the witness room, both from his supporters and the victims' families. The case had dragged through the courts for over 2 decades, with debates about juvenile justice and redemption. In the end, the state moved forward. Smith's execution added another chapter to Oklahoma's long history with capital punishment, leaving many to wonder about the true price of closure and whether anyone ever really finds peace in the death chamber. Brian Joseph Dorsey, April 9th, 2024, Missouri. Brian Joseph Dorsey's journey to the execution chamber began on a cold December night in 2006. He was 34 years old when he committed a double homicide, taking the lives of his cousin and her husband in a crime that shocked the community. Prosecutors described a brutal, senseless act, and the evidence was overwhelming. Dorsey's defense centered around his struggles with addiction and mental health, arguing that his actions were out of character and fueled by desperation. Over the years, countless appeals focused on questions of his mental competency and the fairness of his trial, but none brought him relief. As his final day arrived, Dorsey requested a simple but comforting last meal: fried catfish, hush puppies, and chocolate cake, a taste of the South before his last breath. In the execution chamber, surrounded by witnesses, he used his final words to express sorrow and regret. "I wish I could change everything that happened. I'm truly sorry. I hope that someday there can be forgiveness." His voice was steady but heavy, echoing in the chamber. For many, Dorsey's case was a sobering reminder of how addiction and mental illness can lead to tragedy, and how the ripple effects of violence touch everyone, from victims' families to the condemned. Jamie Ray Mills, May 30th, 2024. The state of Alabama carried out the execution of Jamie Ray Mills, age 50, after a crime that haunted a small town for decades. In 1994, Mills, then 30, was convicted of murdering an elderly couple during a home invasion that turned violent. The crime was marked by its brutality and the apparent lack of remorse. Over the years, Mills' attorneys filed appeals citing ineffective counsel and alleged prosecutorial misconduct, but none succeeded in sparing his life. For his last meal, Mills chose classic Southern comfort food: barbecue ribs, macaroni and cheese, and sweet tea. As he was led into the chamber, Mills appeared calm but weary. When offered the chance to speak, he turned to the victims' families and said, "I cannot take back what I've done. I am sorry from the depths of my heart. I pray you can find peace and healing." His execution drew protest from anti-death penalty advocates, who argued that decades on death row had changed him. For others, it was the final chapter in a long pursuit of justice. Mills's story reflects the enduring debate over the death penalty in America. Does execution bring closure, or does it simply perpetuate the pain of the original crime? David Russell Hosier. On June 11, 2024, Missouri executed David Russell Hosier, a case that underscored the intersection of love, obsession, and violence. At 54, Hosier was convicted of murdering a woman he had been romantically involved with, along with her husband, in a jealous rage. Prosecutors presented evidence of stalking, threats, and, ultimately, murder. Hozier maintained his innocence through years of appeals, claiming the evidence against him was circumstantial and that he was framed. For his last meal, Hozier requested steak, baked potato, and a slice of pecan pie, a final taste of freedom. In his final statement, he addressed the families of the victims and his own. "I did not commit these crimes, but I am sorry for your loss and pain. May God bring you comfort." Some witnesses noted a defiant edge in his words, while others saw a broken man at the end of his road. Hozier's execution reignited debates in Missouri over the reliability of convictions based on circumstantial evidence and the moral implications of capital punishment. For some, it was the end of a painful story. For others, questions lingered long after the drugs took effect. Ramiro Felix Gonzalez, June 26, 2024, Texas. Ramiro Felix Gonzalez was just 18 when he committed the crime that would define his life and death. He was convicted of kidnapping, sexual assault, and murder, crimes that left a young woman dead and a community reeling. Over the years, Gonzalez expressed deep remorse, dedicating himself to spiritual growth and asking for forgiveness from the victim's family. His appeals focused on his age at the time of the crime and questions about his upbringing, but none were successful. For his last meal, Gonzalez requested tamales, enchiladas, and flan, a nod to his Hispanic heritage and the comforts of home. As he lay strapped to the gurney, he spoke softly. "I am sorry for all the pain I've caused. I hope my death brings some peace. I ask for forgiveness from everyone I hurt." His voice trembled and tears flowed freely. Outside the prison, protests and prayers continued long into the night. Gonzalez's execution brought renewed attention to the question of executing those who committed their crimes as teenagers and whether redemption is ever truly possible behind prison walls. Richard Norman Rojem, Jr. On June 27, 2024, Oklahoma executed Richard Norman Rojem, Jr., 66 years old and nearly 40 years removed from the crime that sealed his fate. At 26, Rojem was convicted of the abduction, assault, and murder of a child, a case so disturbing it left scars on the entire state. His appeals focused on claims of mental illness, the conditions of his interrogation, and ineffective counsel. But after decades, the courts stood by the original verdict. For his last meal, Rojem chose fried chicken, mashed potatoes, and peach cobbler, an echo of childhood comfort. When asked if he had any final words, he simply said, "I am sorry for what I did. I have no excuse. I pray for the family and for my soul." The room was silent, the weight of years felt by everyone present. For many, Rojem's execution brought closure to one of Oklahoma's most notorious crimes, while others questioned the justice of carrying out an execution so many years after the crime. His case stands as a stark example of both the long reach of memory and the unresolved pain of violent loss. Keith Edmund Gavin, July 18, 2024, Alabama. The execution of Keith Edmund Gavin, age 64, closed a decades-long chapter of pain and loss for all involved. At 37, Gavin was convicted of murdering a police officer during a robbery, a crime that brought heartbreak to his own family and to the law enforcement community. Gavin's appeals over the years focused on claims of racial bias and inadequate defense, but these were denied at every turn. For his last meal, Gavin requested fried catfish, collard greens, and cornbread, classic Southern fare. As the moment arrived, Gavin addressed the officer's family and his own. "I am deeply sorry for what happened. I wish I could take it back. I hope you find healing and peace." He ended with a prayer, clutching a small cross. The execution was met with mixed emotions, relief for some, sadness for others. Gavin's story, like many on death row, reflected themes of regret, the consequences of a single moment, and the enduring impact of violence on all sides. Arthur Lee Burton. On August 7, 2024, Texas executed Arthur Lee Burton, age 54. At 27, Burton was convicted in a case involving robbery, sexual assault, and murder, a violent spree that left a trail of devastation. During his long stay on death row, Burton expressed remorse for his actions, yet insisted that certain details of his case were misunderstood. His legal team raised issues about the fairness of his trial, but the state moved forward. For his last meal, Burton requested chicken fried steak, mashed potatoes, and apple pie, a familiar Texas comfort meal. In his final words, he said, "I'm sorry to the families for the pain I've caused. I hope you find peace. I take full responsibility." He also thanked his supporters for standing by him and urged his children to live better lives. As the lethal drugs took effect, witnesses noted a calm resolve. The story of Arthur Lee Burton is a reminder of the long shadows cast by violent crime and of the efforts by some to seek redemption, even when it seems too late. Tabaron Dave Honey. August 8, 2024, Utah. Tabaron Dave Honey, age 48, was put to death by lethal injection after spending more than 2 decades on death row. At 22, Honey was convicted of a brutal murder committed during a burglary, a case marked by violence and a complex web of family ties. Over the years, Honey's appeals highlighted claims of childhood trauma and addiction, but none succeeded. For his final meal, Honey requested fry bread, beef stew, and berry pudding, a nod to his Native American heritage. As the curtain opened in the execution chamber, Honey addressed the victim's family and his own. "I am truly sorry. I wish I could undo everything. Please forgive me. I pray for peace for your family and mine." His words were soft but clear, and he appeared at peace in his final moments. Honey's case brought renewed attention to the struggles faced by Native Americans in the justice system and the complex intersection of crime, culture, and redemption. Loran Kensley Cole. August 29, 2024, Florida. Loran Kensley Cole's execution closed the book on a crime that had haunted Orlando since 1994. Cole, then 27, was convicted of the torture and murder of a man during a robbery, an act described by prosecutors as exceptionally cruel. Through decades of appeals, Cole's defense argued that evidence had been mishandled and his trial unfair, but the courts remained unmoved. Cole requested a last meal of seafood platter, hush puppies, and key lime pie, a meal he said reminded him of happier times. In his final statement, Cole expressed remorse for his actions and asked the victim's family for forgiveness. "I'm sorry for all the pain I've caused. I hope my death brings you closure," he said. The execution, carried out with little fanfare, nonetheless attracted protests and prayers from both sides of the death penalty debate. For many, Cole's case was a painful reminder of the devastating effects of violent crime and the endless questions about justice and mercy. Freddie Eugene Owens. September 20th, 2024, South Carolina. Freddie Eugene Owens, age 46, was executed for a crime committed when he was just 19 years old. Owens was convicted of killing a convenience store clerk during a botched robbery, a crime caught on camera that left little doubt about his guilt. His legal team fought for years, citing his youth and troubled upbringing, but appeals ran out. For his last meal, Owens requested fried shrimp, fries, and chocolate cake, a familiar Southern meal. In his last words, Owens addressed the family of his victim. "I can't change what happened, but I hope you find peace. I am sorry for your pain." He also thanked his own family for standing by him through the years. Owens' execution reignited discussions about the death penalty for crimes committed by young offenders, and whether redemption can be found after decades behind bars. For the victim's family, it was the end of a long wait. For others, the debate continues. Marcellus Scott Williams. On September 24, 2024, Missouri carried out the execution of Marcellus Scott Williams, age 55. Williams' conviction stemmed from a 1998 murder during a robbery, a crime that left the St. Louis community in shock. Over the years, new evidence, including DNA testing, brought attention to possible errors in the case, sparking public debate and calls for clemency. Despite this, the courts moved forward, citing the weight of the original evidence. For his last meal, Williams requested fried fish, hush puppies, and lemon pie. In his final words, he spoke directly to the victim's family and his own. "I did not commit this crime, but I am sorry for your pain. I hope you find peace and healing." Williams' execution was met with protests and widespread media attention, with many arguing that his case represented the dangers of executing the potentially innocent. For others, the state's decision brought long-awaited closure, though doubts remain. Travis James Mullis, September 24, 2024, Texas. Travis James Mullis was executed for a crime that shocked even veteran law enforcement officers. At 21, Mullis was convicted of the murder of an infant, his girlfriend's child, in a case marked by its brutality and heartbreak. Mullis's attorneys raised issues of mental illness and trauma, but appeals were unsuccessful. For his last meal, Mullis requested cheeseburgers, fries, and a chocolate shake, a meal reminiscent of youth and simpler times. In his final words, Mullis expressed deep regret. "I am sorry beyond words. I pray that the family can heal. I hope my death brings some measure of peace." His voice was choked with emotion and tears flowed freely. The case left a lasting scar on everyone involved, from investigators to jurors to the families themselves. For many, Mullis's execution was a somber end to a deeply painful story, a reminder of the devastating impact of violence and loss. Emmanuel Antonia Littlejohn. On September 26, 2024, Oklahoma executed Emmanuel Antonia Littlejohn, age 52, for a crime that occurred more than 3 decades earlier. Littlejohn, just 20 at the time, was convicted in the robbery and murder of a convenience store clerk. His appeals focused on claims of inadequate defense and the fairness of his trial, but the courts held firm. For his last meal, Littlejohn requested fried chicken, collard greens, and cornbread, a classic comfort meal. In his final words, he apologized to the victim's family and expressed hope for forgiveness. "I am deeply sorry for your loss. I pray that God brings you comfort and peace. I take responsibility for my actions." The execution was attended by family members of both the victim and the condemned, each seeking closure in their own way. Littlejohn's story serves as a reminder of the long-lasting consequences of a single, tragic choice, and the decades of pain that follow. Alan Eugene Miller. September 26, 2024, Alabama. Alan Eugene Miller's execution was notable for its method, nitrogen hypoxia, used for only the second time in U.S. history. Miller, age 59, was convicted for a 1999 workplace shooting that left 3 people dead, a crime that stunned the state. During his years on death row, Miller's appeals focused on his mental health and the constitutionality of the execution method. For his last meal, Miller requested meatloaf, mashed potatoes, and green beans, a hearty, familiar plate. In his final words, Miller expressed regret for his actions, but also criticized the justice system. "I'm sorry for what happened. I pray for the families. I hope my story is a lesson. The system is broken." As the nitrogen gas was administered, witnesses described a somber, tense silence in the chamber. Miller's execution drew protests and international scrutiny, reigniting debate about both the death penalty and the methods used to carry it out in America. Garcia Glenn White. On October 1, 2024, Texas executed Garcia Glenn White, age 61. White's crime was particularly notorious. At 26, he was convicted of murdering 3 people during a robbery, a case that lingered in Houston's collective memory for decades. White's legal team fought long and hard, citing claims of mental illness and unfair trial, but the sentence remained. For his last meal, White requested fried catfish, coleslaw, and peach cobbler. In his final statement, he said, "I am sorry for the pain I've caused. I hope the families can heal. May God have mercy on me." The execution was witnessed by family members and was the subject of local news coverage, sparking yet another debate on Texas's use of the death penalty. For the victims' families, it marked the end of a long wait for justice, but for others, questions lingered about rehabilitation and mercy. Derek Ryan Dearman, October 17, 2024, Alabama. Derek Ryan Dearman's case stands as one of the most shocking mass murders in the state's history. At 27, Dearman killed 6 people, including an unborn child, in a single night of violence, driven by rage and jealousy. The crime left families shattered and an entire community in mourning. Over the years, Dearman's appeals cited drug addiction and mental illness, but the state moved forward with his execution. For his last meal, Dearman requested fried chicken, mashed potatoes, and pecan pie. In his final words, he addressed the victims' families. "There are no words that can undo the pain. I am truly sorry. I pray that God gives you peace and strength." The execution was attended by survivors and family members, each grappling with grief in their own way. Dearman's case remains a haunting reminder of the destructive power of violence and the devastating impact of a single night's choices. Richard Bernard Moore, November 1, 2024. South Carolina executed Richard Bernard Moore, age 59, for a murder committed when he was 34. Moore was convicted of killing a store clerk during a botched robbery. He claimed he had not intended to kill, but the evidence was overwhelming. His case attracted national attention, especially for the years-long battle over the method of execution. Moore even requested a firing squad over lethal injection, making headlines. For his last meal, Moore requested pizza, steak, and a chocolate milkshake, a combination that spoke to both comfort and nostalgia. In his last words, Moore said, "I am sorry for the pain I've caused. I take responsibility. I pray for forgiveness, for the victim's family, and for my own." Moore's execution was carried out with considerable media scrutiny, and his case remains a focal point in the ongoing debate about the death penalty and the ethics of execution methods. Carrie Dale Grayson, November 21, 2024, Alabama. Carrie Dale Grayson's execution marked the end of a case that had haunted Birmingham since 1994. At 19, Grayson was part of a group that murdered and mutilated a homeless man, a crime described as one of the most brutal in Alabama history. Over the years, his attorneys raised issues of youth, mental illness, and inadequate defense, but all appeals failed. For his last meal, Grayson requested fried chicken, French fries, and chocolate cake. When asked for his final words, he said, "I regret everything I did. I am sorry for the pain I caused. I hope my death brings peace." His execution was attended by members of both families, as well as anti-death penalty advocates who argued that Grayson's youth should have spared him. His story remains a testament to the enduring debate over how society should handle violent offenders, especially those who were just teenagers at the time of their crimes. Christopher Leroy Collings. On December 3, 2024, Missouri executed Christopher Leroy Collings, age 49. Collings was 32 when he was convicted of the kidnapping, assault, and murder of a young girl, a crime that shocked the state and led to changes in how such cases are handled. Throughout his time on death row, Collings admitted his guilt and expressed remorse, cooperating with investigators to provide details of his crime. For his last meal, Collings chose fried chicken, mashed potatoes, and chocolate pudding. In his final statement, he apologized to the victim's family. "I am deeply sorry. Nothing I can say or do will ever make it right. I pray that you find some peace." Collings' case was widely reported in the media and renewed calls for tougher laws on crimes against children. For many, his execution was seen as justice served, but for others, it was yet another painful chapter in a long story of tragedy. Joseph Edward Corcoran, December 18, 2024, Indiana. Joseph Edward Corcoran's life and death were shaped by violence from an early age. At 22, Corcoran killed 4 family members in a shooting spree that was attributed to untreated mental illness and a history of abuse. His attorneys fought for years, arguing that Corcoran's actions were the product of severe mental health issues, but the courts ultimately upheld the sentence. For his last meal, Corcoran requested pizza, garlic bread, and cheesecake. In his final words, he addressed his family and the victims' families. "I'm sorry. I loved you all, even though I didn't show it. I hope you find healing and peace." The execution was witnessed by relatives of both the victims and the condemned, each seeking a measure of closure. Corcoran's story highlights the complex interplay between mental illness, family trauma, and the justice system, raising important questions about how society responds to the most troubled among us. Kevin Ray Underwood. On December 19, 2024, Oklahoma executed Kevin Ray Underwood, age 45. Underwood's crime was one of the most notorious in the state's recent history: the 2006 abduction and murder of a young girl. Prosecutors described a chilling, premeditated act. During his years on death row, Underwood expressed remorse and cooperated with investigators, but never sought to avoid responsibility. For his last meal, Underwood chose cheeseburgers, onion rings, and a chocolate milkshake. When asked for his final words, he said, "I am truly sorry for what I did. I hope my death brings some peace to those I've hurt." Underwood's execution closed a painful chapter for the victim's family and for the state of Oklahoma. His case remains a haunting reminder of the darkest sides of human behavior and of the lasting pain caused by violent crime. Thank you for watching. These stories are difficult but important to hear. Our goal is not to glorify or exploit tragedy, but to educate, showing the human side behind every headline and reminding us all of the real cost of violence and justice. If you found this video insightful, please hit like, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to our channel for more. Remember, these videos are for awareness and discussion only. Stay curious, stay compassionate, and we'll see you in the next one.